So, Jason, we've talked about the Get Off My Lawn browser.
Yes.
And let's focus in and let's talk about the Get Off My Lawn root store.
Yes, Tim. What did I make and why is a part of it. So I talked about this in a previous episode, and it's gone through many iterations now. And I landed at a point where I asked you, let's do another episode on it, because I've landed at I finally have something that I would call a root store.
Okay.
Why did I do this? And it's precisely because you and I have this is, by the way, the 5th season of the Toronto sessions of the Root Causes podcast. So cool. And as part...
We have short seasons, in all fairness.
It's short seasons, but they're high-quality short seasons.
Yes, they are, yeah.
As part of the 500th episode celebration, one of the things I just wanted to accomplish was for our podcast to have its own browser.
Yeah.
Because you and I off the cuff once had a joke about we're going to have an old fogey's browser that is really tightened down, privacy focused, security focused, and call it the Get Off My Lawn browser.
Right.
And so, yes, I created that, but it didn't seem enough. What to me would make it interesting is if we had our own root store.
Yeah.
Now, what's the difference between what I'm doing and just going into Chrome or Firefox or Edge or whatever you like and just adjusting, removing or adding to the root store? What I wanted to accomplish was, what does it really take to make a root store, number one? And there's some interesting findings to that, and that's the point of this podcast. But I think the second one is, Tim, I, as a browser of the internet, I've been browsing the internet since it was Telnet into CERN.
Yep.
And you clicked on a word, and you could hypertext into another page. To me, it was exciting to build this root store because it kind of took me right back to the beginnings of what the technology actually is. And I think you characterized me the other day as being like, I forget your exact words, but like, sophisticated power user of the internet.
Right.
And to me, when you think about, are there too many CAs? Well, here's a way you could flip that to the extreme. Of course, we do things extreme on the Root Causes podcast. And the extreme is, hey, I know what CA is underneath a particular website that I want to browse to. Mm-hmm. Can I very rapidly distrust all CAs except for the one that I need at the moment? Now, most of your browsing, that doesn't make sense. There's a chicken and egg problem. Right. You don't know the CA of a domain until you browse to it, unless you're looking up CT logs and you might be able to discern it. So therefore, this makes a point. That's why there are 143 roots in the Mozilla root store program at this given point in time, because you want to be able to browse the internet without having to think about the trust. The trust is already set in the root store. But what happens if you really, really want to go extreme and you want to very rapidly not trust anything except for the thing you absolutely need, or have a very, very small subset that you very quickly want to re-expand and re-trust all of the CAs again?
Yeah.
And that was the point to the root store that I created. That's the reason why. I wanted to have wide aperture and extremely narrow aperture of trust at will.
So the narrow aperture would be for, tell me if I'm getting this right. The narrow aperture would be for a certain set of defined tasks where the stakes are high and you have a high degree of confidence that you either know the root or it is one of a small subset of roots. So for instance, accessing your bank might fall into that category.
Perfect example.
And then the wide aperture would be just a whatever. I'm following information, trying to learn about a topic that I don't know anything about, and I might navigate to anybody, and I don't know what route they'll be on. Is that correct?
That is correct. So let's say there's a website, a domain that I don't know the CA yet. I haven't looked it up, but I'm gonna browse to it. And if my browser says, "Oh, that's not in the root store," I start to get interested, and I want to see the CA information right inside my browser. So therefore, that's what the Get Off My Lawn browser does very well.
Right.
The CA information and the certificate information is right in front of you. And so therefore, before any HTML is rendered, right, before any website information is rendered, the TLS handshake happens, and there is I'm reading the TLS information. And then there is an interrogation. Hey, is this trusted? Does this chain up to anything that's in my root store? And if it's not, it starts to get me interested, right? So I start to think, well, what is this? And sometimes if it's outside of my narrow aperture of 6 CAs that I just allow myself to generally browse, it's quite often because it might be European or again, as you've said, regional of regional interest, this particular website domain, and therefore the certificate might come from a very small CA that serves that region, for language purposes or government purposes. And then I can make a decision for myself. Do I want to proceed and actually render the website and actually have a look at it? So it's almost like none of the browsers would ever design themselves that way because the public just wouldn't put up with it. But I put up with it because I'm curious about these things. And what I've learned, there's a few things that I've learned is with just a very small handful of CAs that issue most of the world's publicly trusted TLS server certificates, I can get away with an extremely small, narrow aperture for most of my browsing.
Right.
And that's
I mean, I don't even want to call it an 80-20 rule because it's more like a 99.920 rule, right? Or a 99.97 rule, right? Where just a little bit of it, just a pretty narrow set of roots will get you almost everything you're going to run into in your regular life. Like, I think it's distinctly possible that either one of us could go for weeks or months without bumping into something we can't resolve just based on a half dozen CAs. I think it's very credible. But there is a set of legitimate, honest, non-crooked domains that fall out of that. And that's where a giant mainstream browser like Safari or Chrome has to account for that. Where the Get Off My Lawn browser, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Right.
And I've actually tried to see whether or not a fairly, not a microscopic aperture like 1 CA, but a very narrow aperture of 6 CAs allows me to browse the internet without thinking very much at all.
Sure.
And I tell you,
doesn't surprise me.
And so when I look at the rest of the CAs, the long tail, boy, there's stuff in there that I'm not telling the root stores what to trust and what not to trust. That's their business, and the CAB forum is there to determine these kinds of things. But for me personally, your analogy of the castle wall with many openings, there's a lot of openings. And closing those off, it makes me feel good.
Yeah, and you could probably brick off, and I think we're saying the same thing just with an analogy now, but you could probably brick off 90+% of those openings and never once for the rest of your life be inconvenienced by it.
That's what I'm finding.
Yeah.
That was part of the experiment. Now, people could say to me, well, Jay, you didn't need to build your own browser for that. You could have managed throughout something else. Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to create my own browser and my own root store program was also to determine what's the nature of the root store. And I got to tell you, it took a lot of iterations and a lot of experimenting. a lot of times building a browser is not that difficult, Tim. You take Chromium and you just put your own wrapper around it, and you got yourself a browser. Well, that's what Edge is, and that's what Brave is, and there's a bunch of browsers like that now. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but they're taking a rendering engine that exists, and they're basically putting their coat of paint on it, and plus some extra functionality. I thought I was going to do the same thing, and it turned out I couldn't, because the browsers themselves are so intrinsically linked to their chosen root store that is baked hard into the operating system. So in other words, I did WebKit. In other words, I kind of rewrapped my own Safari. I did Chromium. I was making my own Chrome. What I ended up having to do was this. I had to actually make my own root store. Speed was a problem. I originally wrote all this stuff in Python. Python was my glue code. And I was using some TLS libraries to help to interrogate the SSL certificate and all these things. But the speed was horrendous. And I thought to myself, this isn't a very good experiment because it doesn't act like a browser. It kind of acts like something else, not very good. So I rewrote everything, and this took me a long time. I actually kind of taught myself Rust language more than I had known before. So I'm fairly proficient now in Rust language to a point. And I used Rust TLS, something we reported on this podcast a long time ago.
Russell's,
Russell's. And it works, and it works great. It works really great. And not having to worry about buffer overflow, memory pointer errors by having such close to the metal code that operates quickly. Normally you'd write these kinds of things in C++, but Rust was just a great choice. So having a pure 100% Rust stack is something I achieved. And yes, the performance made a gigantic difference. But did it make enough difference that it is as fast as a normal browser that you're used to using? And I got it there, but my God, Tim, was it ever difficult to have my own rendering engine that was not intrinsically tied to a root store in an operating system and have my own. That was tremendously difficult. And it really shows you that the browsing we do on our phones and on our laptops and wherever else we might browse, I don't think people stop to think about just how deeply, deeply tied their browser is down into the guts of the operating system in order to make things happen very rapidly.
Right.
Because latency is a killer when you're browsing. People want to browse as fast as possible. You want websites to come up as fast as possible. And part of that,
not to mention not only that, but there's a lot of browsing activity, or let's call it certificate consuming activity, that you don't witness directly. That absolutely affects performance, right? There's all kinds of services that are connecting to a server somewhere and trying to get something done.
Think about the amount of advertisements that are injected into sites and JavaScripts that are going off, and the TLS handshake itself is it's quite a lengthy. We've gotten it down to a science now, and it happens very rapidly. But it's kind of those things where when you're trying to redesign all of it, you have a new appreciation for just how well it's done. And so, my goodness, Tim, it was a real challenge, a bigger challenge than I thought. But to get off my lawn browser, now, yes, it is using other people's libraries, Russell's.
Sure.
I am using a very rudimentary Rust-based rendering engine, but it is a browser and it is a root store with a consumer of one. So
with a consumer of one, yes. Or a user base of one, yes.
User base of one. But it made for some, the fact that I can, with one button click, change my aperture of trust and be able to see the effect of it in normal daily browsing is a fascinating experience.
It's got to be.
So For those of you who are watched to this point of the podcast, don't make your own. Don't roll your own crypto. Don't roll your own root store program. It isn't worth it. But if you do, you'll learn a lot. And the one thing that I'll leave it with, Tim, is it kind of gave me the excitement I had when I was first browsing. And
sure.
it, we're talking like early 1990s browsing.
It was all very adventurous.
It's all very adventurous. And so making it myself brought back that sense of adventure.
I believe that. All right. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Tim.